So let's touch on this relationship of the Christian mystics and non-dual consciousness, which is becoming a term that's more and more widely used in sort of Western spirituality to describe a certain perspective, state of mind, level of consciousness. It's sort of a tricky term to pin down and see how it fits, but we're gonna take a stab at it. So first, there is a relationship between non-dual awareness and Scripture because it ties into the kenotic letting go of our egoic position, our egoic lens, our default small self sort of lenses, and our judgments, mental categories that we sort of carve the world and our experiences into. Part of becoming more Christ-like in the contemplative sense is in this verse from Philippians 2:5. Let this mind be in you, which it was also in Christ Jesus, who existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to cling to, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in human likeness. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And that term emptied himself is the kenotic turn, or the self-emptying, the letting go, the emptying out of what? What do we empty ourselves of? Of precisely the ego identity that wants to have certain outcomes, filters the world through a lens. We hold on to our paradigms, that those cause division and provide the seeds of violence in our world. And a contemplative practice, say, of centering prayer, is intentionally not clearing out the mind. This is, Cynthia Bourgeault touches on this frequently. It's not clearing out the mind, but this continual kenotic gesture. When we recognize a thought, we return to the sacred word and let the thought go and return to the silence. And that's the kenotic practice of this ongoing letting go and allowing that inner transformation to take place, and in so doing, putting on the mind of Christ. And this is, when we do that as a physical gesture, it changes how we are in the world. And that is different from adding another bullet point to our doctrinal list of shaping and subdividing our paradigm more and more, that we have a small patch of mental land that we defend and stake out that subject position, but we carry it in the body as a continual experience of letting go and move about the world. It's a transformed way of being in the world. That's why those, for us at Contemplative Light, those practices on a daily basis are so important. And they help us practice not being in that constricted state of identifying phenomena that we maybe even disagree with as threats that trigger the fight or flight response. But we are able to remain open, and that is a physical manifestation. So Richard Rohr talks about non-duality a lot. He has the following to say: spiritual traditions at their higher levels discovered that the primary addiction for all humans is addiction to our own way of thinking. And contemplation teaches us how to observe that small mind and to see how inadequate it is to the task in front of us, especially if we accept that we are called to love the world more and more deeply. That mental paradigm that is triggered and we carry around with us and we unconsciously use to evaluate the world is an obstacle. So non-duality is a synonym for awakening or enlightenment expressed in a lot of other traditions. It's this kind of borrowed term from a lot of Eastern practices. And in a book called The Heart of Centering Prayer, Cynthia Bourgeault kind of gets into making distinctions between non-dual awareness or non-duality and what the Christian tradition traditionally has called unitive seeing. We can kind of describe like good apophatic theologians, what the non-dual consciousness is by kind of describing dualistic consciousness. And so that is essentially binary either-or thinking that knows by comparison, opposition, and differentiation, says Richard Rohr. So it uses descriptive words like good and evil. It wants to divide into pretty and ugly, smart and stupid. It's evaluative mind, first and foremost. Not realizing there could be 100 degrees between the two ends of the spectrum, and that's key. This reductionistic simplification of saying, this is good, that's bad, not dynamically present and aware to the subtle shifts and changing present moment that requires sort of setting aside the predetermined paradigm and the prefabricated categories so that we can dynamically be present in the moment and allow a loving dynamic, a loving presence to emerge. Most of us settle for quick and easy answers instead of any deep perception, which we leave to poets, philosophers, and prophets. Yet depth and breadth of perception should be the primary arena for all authentic religion. How else could we possibly search for God? By being alive to the ways in which He manifests. We do need the dualistic mind to function in everyday life and to do the work, to engage with the world around us. But it's limited, and it won't get us to where we can process things like infinity, mystery, grace, suffering, sexuality, death, love. And that's why most people stumble over those issues. The dualistic mind pulls everything down into some kind of tit-for-tat system of false choices and oversimplified contraries, sort of false equivalencies, which is largely what fast food religion teaches, usually without even knowing it. Without the contemplative and converted mind, honest and humble perception, much religion is frankly dangerous. From Richard Rohr again. Some touchstone scriptures from the Bible, from Paul. He enters into this level of awareness sometimes, sometimes not. No longer I, but Christ lives in me is one example of this. And then Christ himself, Jesus, before Abraham was, I am. There's this identification with the transcendent presence and reality and divinity that transcends time and the small egoic self. Cynthia Bourgeault talks about we sort of falsely equate non-duality with mystical experience, and the two are related in that one can become sort of a trigger into moving toward the other. But and she talks about that all mystical experience is inherently non-dual, whether it's Hildegard of Bingen or Meister Eckhart, who are sort of noted non-dual teachers in the mystical Christian tradition. Tauler and Suso, those Rhineland mystics who were the followers of Eckhart, or down to our own day, people like Bernadette Roberts was an example of that. But their descriptions of the mystical experience are sort of brief, overpowering experiences of oneness, where the separate self-sense dissolves and we feel ourselves to be connected to the transcendent reality. And Thomas Merton has a famous description of that in Louisville on the corner of 4th and Walnut. I believe there's even a plaque that kind of has part of this quote on there. Merton says, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being a man, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate, as if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me. Now I realize what we all are, and if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people they're all walking around, shining like the sun. So the boundaries dissolve. There's an experience of oneness and wholeness, and that it's not just within us. But that is the nature of reality. That is the that's the perception that we now have that transcends our small self. Whether other people agree with us or not, we recognize that inherent interrelatedness and seeing God interconnected in within all, wherever it is. Let's say people are in their own process of spiritual maturation. Cynthia Bourgeault notes, though, that those tend to be temporary states, not stages, perpetual of experience and perception. And so that movement toward a perpetual stage is what the contemplative life is about, a movement into becoming and rooted in non-duality. We've already said we need dualistic consciousness to sort of move about and accomplish practical tasks, but it's staying rooted in that as a primary mode of awareness as we encounter people and go about having experiences. In the East, that experience tends to be described as monistic, meaning everything is just part of the same whole. And a transcendent contemplative awareness means recognizing that everything is one, and we will all sort of dissolve back into that eventually. Whereas in the West, with our unitive consciousness, divine union is not identification. It's not saying that we all dissolve into God if we could see rightly, but instead there's still an I that is infused with God and relates to God. It's a union, not an identification with. We still remain distinct somehow. So, in that Western notion of being sort of joined in mystical love with God. And so that is a distinction between sort of traditionally Eastern and Western notions, at least as currently understood. One way to put this is it's not a shift in what we see or what we think, but how we see and how we relate to what we think. That's a key distinction. It's this movement of consciousness beyond the identification with the small self. We learn to let go of our conventional limited subject position and embrace a much sort of wider opening. It's like a bird's eye view of a situation as a whole or creation as a whole, of which we are always sort of an interwoven part. Non-duality says that my preferences, my desires, my ego has to be brought to light so that I can integrate that into whatever situation I find myself in and be aware and see things, even my own ego tendencies, through the eyes of love. We experience reality as this whole body of which we are a part, and sort of the interrelatedness, what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing, that without selectively mediating it through our own identifications, that experience of oneness or non-duality is rooted primarily in experience. It's a transformed way of being. It's not an ideology or set of doctrines we internalize. Usually we try to find the language and make sense of it after the fact. But at the same time, it's not an anti-intellectual stance. It's not saying forget about learning, forget about language, forget about trying to articulate something of this paradigm, even though that's limited. But that work, any intellectual work or a new understanding or teaching, has to be anchored in that primary way of being and way of relating to the world. So another way to articulate it is that our dualistic mind is the implied position out of which we judge, assess, evaluate, oppose, resist, reject, ridicule sometimes. And we can see those manifestations sometimes in our conversations. We notice it on our own thoughts. Maybe if we're listening to someone lecture right here, there's a process of evaluation. Probably if you're listening to this, you have at least undergone some process of transformation to increase your openness. So many people, and anyone in any faith community will be aware of this, are just about the work of, I already figured out what I think and believe, and now I'm just going to go around and kind of evaluate. And we exist in that evaluative mode, conscious or unconsciously, And we just have a running tape. The thoughts come and we kind of put people into categories, even just kind of silently walking down the street. And so that is the dualistic mind. And non-dualistic mind says, I'm not going to predetermine what I think or impose categories, but I will, as much as possible, be aware of myself doing that so that I can allow myself to have loving interactions. And that judgmental mind leads to a state of constriction and limits that ability to manifest love in the world. If we spend a lot of our time sort of trivializing, reducing in pettiness in that judgmental mind, which for so many of us is kind of a default egoic position, we're in the dualistic mind, that normal sort of narcissism that starts with putting people and experiences into categories. But the non-dual perspective kind of blows away the categories, scatters the categories. So we are just sort of open to accept reality as it is and be in dynamic relationship with that. So, of course, it doesn't mean we don't make distinctions or make decisions or make use of categories. Of course, practically we have to, but cultivating non-dual awareness means being open to the next moment and the next moment, without predetermining who people are and how to relate to them automatically. Another way to put this is to see with the eyes of the heart, which we sometimes seem to mean be more emotional, be more compassionate, more empathically connected. But instead, what if that could be a permanent state, is what the mystics ask. What if our default all the time position was to see with the eyes of the heart? To put on the mind of Christ and see creation, including ourselves, through that perspective. So I invite you to that for a day. Just take a single day, pick out and be intentional about, say, a prayer in the morning, if that helps. See, simply observe, go about your normal experience, but kind of through the eyes of Christ, your own thoughts, your speech, your daily habits and patterns. And that gets some flavor of what the contemplative mystical life is, intentionally bringing that presence and awareness to bear on our everyday actions. And part of this shift from building a sort of sociocentric or egoic faith system that needs certainty, that needs answers, that builds defense mechanisms, that judges, that relies on a sort of in-group dogma to define and preserve itself, is usually with a built-in hierarchy, and then build an identity based on what's in, what's out. When the internal awakening happens, that's usually, again, brought about by suffering or tension, some awakening. We see that process, that project, for the sort of egoic game that it is. Those boundaries that we put up to defend ourselves start to dissolve. Usually that's a state that we experience temporarily, but we want it to become a stage where it's a newfound center of gravity out of which we live and move and have our being, to use the language from the scriptures, in openness, channeling divine love. But doing that requires kind of bringing that gracious, gentle, loving observation and presence into our own daily life. Another component of this is that in God there is always mystery. The mysterium tremendum et fascinans. There's that which we profess or believe. There's that which we articulate and understand. There's that which we experience. But in God, there is always more than that, more than we can conceptualize, more than we can articulate. There's some margin of mystery. However great or small we allow that is, it's there. Part of non-duality is accepting that unknown component, accepting the mysterious component, accepting the contradictory, the paradoxical, without trying to impose, force, pin down, reduce into simple categories that kind of consolidate my own ego position. It is instead, a hallmark of spiritual maturity is this deep acceptance, deep openness, and out of that space, this greater and greater capacity for love develops. And part of this is the contemplative or mystical understanding that stands somewhat in contrast to a traditional sort of Western understanding that the self is and always has been in God. And this divine spark, the divine indwelling, being an inherent part of our being. And so the understanding of the mystic who, after the awakening especially, sees, wow, it's all in God. That stands in contrast to this notion that God is separate from, transcendent. We sort of need to accept the atonement and sacrifice of Jesus as the only bridge between this radically distant God because of our fallen sin nature, and there's that chasm that's opened up between us and God, and it's this quite distant relationship that has to be overcome only through submission to the sacrifice of Christ. Presupposes a subject-object dualism, whereas the experience of the mystic is sort of waking up into the awareness of the self as pre-existing in God, waking up to that divine reality. I want to close with a quote from Ursula King. "The story of the Christian mystics is one of an all-consuming, passionate love affair between human beings and God. It speaks of the yearning, a burning desire for the contemplation and presence of the divine. This yearning is a candle by the fire of divine love itself, which moves the mystics in their search and leads them, often arduous journeys, to discover and proclaim the all-encompassing love of God for humankind."